Dr. Sarah Snyder, thank you for visiting UNC in Chapel Hill today, and thank you for participating in our 5 Minutes Insights. You are an outstanding aspect on the history and politics of human rights during the Cold War and since the end of the Cold War. How important was human rights in the Cold War, and how important is human rights today? Is it driving America's and other nations' policy?
During the Cold War, I think that human rights had episodic, but at those moments quite important influence, which I don't think has been fully realized previously. In terms of after the Cold War, I think a lot of the hopes of human rights activists and those who care about human rights have been unfulfilled. There was a great sense that after the end of the Cold War, we could move beyond the, say, geopolitical constraints on attention to human rights. But instead other factors have emerged that are now the reasons that the United States might not pay as much attention to human rights as those who care about the issue wish they would.
Thank you. Were there any occasions when the demand for the respect of human rights quite concretely drove America's foreign policy, both during the Cold War and maybe later as well?
I think pressure on human rights drove United States policy at many moments. I would say, though, that the United States may have shifted its policy and, say, advocated for the release of a political prisoner, reduced economic assistance, but perhaps not fully cut off ties or imposed sanctions in the way that activists that supported the issue might have wanted the United States to do. So it's unfortunately often a case of the success was a moderation in policy as opposed to a wholesale change.
When you listen to America's critiques today, then many would say the country doesn't observe human rights at all. They would point to the Iraq War recently, but also many instances of interference in foreign countries in the past that human rights really were on the back burner and did not influence anything at all.
I would say also the U.S. treatment of its prisoners, whether they're in Guantanamo Bay or in domestic prisons in the United States, there are unfortunately a whole host of human rights violations that critics abroad as well as in the United States can point to when assessing this administration as well as recent administrations' records.
So how can the country then go abroad and say, we have to observe, you have to observe human rights, if the own record really leaves much to be demanded?
It's very complicated to do so. And what the United States did during the Cold War, particularly with respect to its civil rights record, was to say, we acknowledge there are problems, we're trying to move forward, and you, who also have problems, should try and make incremental or wholesale change to improve those violations. So the United States tried to use its own story of evolution as a way of inducing other countries to try and improve their records as well. And I think in some ways that might be an effective way for the United States to criticize other countries now, to say, we ourselves have problems, we're trying to change and to sort them out, and you should as well. Instead, I think far too often they're silent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can you think of any role models, cultural leaders, religious leaders, political leaders even, which serve as role models for the pursuit and defense of human rights, both in the United States and abroad?
I mean, there are countless courageous people who are advocating for human rights at the local, region, and international level. I'm very hesitant to pick out one or two. My area of research is the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during the late Cold War. And there I would say someone like Yuri Orlov, who founded the Moscow-Helsinki group, who spent years in prison in internal exile and then was expelled from the Soviet Union at great personal and professional disadvantage, are someone that I would hold up as enormously courageous and also thoughtful. I mean, he and his fellow dissidents were enormously creative in the ways that they tried to induce the Soviet Union to make change. On the American side, someone like George Shultz, who I wouldn't say needs to be as courageous because he was not serving an elected position, he's not facing imprisonment or other things, but he really cared about human rights and made it an essential part of the Reagan administration's agenda in American-Soviet negotiations, which it hadn't previously been, and it wasn't foreordained that this would become a significant issue in the Reagan administration.
Thank you. Usually the Nixon administration is not held high in terms of human rights, while the Carter administration is.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's something in that, or that is a misinterpretation?
Certainly, the Carter administration talked more about human rights and offered more institutional support, whether it was elevating and then naming someone like Pat Darien to be Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. Although that process was begun in the Nixon and Ford years by members of Congress. In general, my research has shown that there's much greater continuity across U.S. administrations, and that there are consistent policies of the Cold War, economic constraints, other issues that are limiting U.S. attention to human rights, and that the person who's in the White House isn't as essential as we might think that it is.
Thank you. As you know, the end of the Cold War and who deserves credit for bringing about the end of the Cold War is quite controversial. Mm-hmm. Some people say it was Ronald Reagan or the peoples of Eastern Europe. Or what about human rights activists? Did they bring about the end of the Cold War?
I think that they played an important role in bringing about the end of the Cold War. It's different than saying they're the entire reason that the Cold War ended. I'm not a big believer in these sort of monocausal explanations, whether it's Reagan or Gorbachev or the state of the Soviet economy. But previously there hasn't been sufficient attention to the role of these human rights activists, and I think they did play a very important role.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sarah Snyder, thank you very much for your insights. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.